Hello to everyone listening from around the world. Today's account comes from Thomas Reyes, 54, who shared what happened the week his wife decided to end their marriage in front of his entire crew, with the man she'd been seeing standing close enough to touch her shoulder. This account has been dramatized to protect privacy. AI narration is used throughout. The experience it describes is real. Get comfortable, pour whatever you're drinking, and settle in. The garage door opener stuck again that morning. 2 clicks before it caught. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the smell of cutting oil that lived permanently in the collar of my work jacket. Not the ringing in my left ear that had been there since 2003 and never fully left. Not the ache behind my knee that showed up around year 40 on the shop floor and never bothered to introduce itself politely. It was the door. Click, click, then the groan of the chain lifting. 3 seconds later than it should have. I'd meant to fix it for 2 years. Kept telling myself Saturday. There was always a reason it wasn't Saturday. I backed the truck out at 5:40 that morning the way I did every morning, and I sat in the driveway for a second listening to the door shutter back down behind me, thinking nothing in particular. That's the strange thing about the last normal morning of your life. It never announces itself. It just goes by looking exactly like the one before it. I'd worked at Ashcroft Precision Tooling for 26 years. Started on the floor at 28, worked my way up to shift foreman by 41, and stayed there because a raise past that point wasn't worth what they'd take from you in hours. I ran 3 CNC lines and 11 people, and I was good at it in the quiet, unglamorous way that never gets written up anywhere. Nobody hands out awards for a floor that doesn't have accidents. My wife's name was Melissa. We'd been married 19 years. We met when she was cocktailing at a place downtown, and I was 29 years old, and thought I had all the time in the world to figure out what kind of man I was going to be. 19 years is long enough to stop noticing a person is changing, until one day you look up, and they've been gone for a while, even though they're still sitting across the table from you. The house on Larchmont Drive had been in my family since before I was born. 2 stories brick. A covered porch my grandfather built with his own hands sometime in the 50s, and a garage that opened on the second try. We lived there the entire marriage. Melissa had never once asked how we'd ended up there instead of buying our own place like other young couples did. I don't think it occurred to her to ask. It was just the house. Our house. That's what she called it, anyway. I want to tell you that I noticed something was wrong before I did. That would make for a better story. The truth is slower and less flattering. The truth is that for about 8 months, Melissa had been going out on Thursday evenings to something she called her book club, and I had never once asked what book they were reading because I was tired, and because after 19 years you stop asking questions you assume you already know the answer to. I found out later there was no book club. There was a man named Gordon Hale, 49 years old, a real estate agent who worked the nicer end of town, the kind of man who wore a blazer to a Tuesday lunch and called it casual. Melissa met him at an open house she wasn't even shopping for. She'd wandered in out of curiosity, the way people do sometimes on a Saturday with nothing to fill an afternoon. Gordon had a way of talking about square footage and market comps that apparently sounded, to a woman who'd spent 19 years listening to me talk about spindle speeds and tolerances, like poetry. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew on the Tuesday it happened was that I had a full production schedule, a quality audit schedule for Thursday, and a wife who'd started leaving the house smelling like a different perfume than the one I'd bought her for Christmas. She showed up at the shop a little after 2 in the afternoon. I remember the sound before I saw her. Heels on the concrete floor of a machine shop carried different than they do anywhere else. Sharp, out of place, like a bell ringing in a room built for something else entirely. I looked up from the line I was running, and there she was, walking to the bay doors in a cream-colored coat I didn't recognize, hair done in a way she saved for weddings, not Tuesdays. She wasn't alone. Gordon Hale walked half a step behind her, hands in his pockets, wearing an expression I'd later come to recognize as his default setting, a kind of practiced, patient amusement, like the whole world was a listing he was pre-qualified to close. Asterisk, don't, not here, asterisk. I shut down the line, wiped my hands on a rag that had seen better decades. 2 of my guys, Marcus and a younger kid named Devin, suddenly developed an urgent interest in a palace stock that did not require that level of attention. Melissa, I kept my voice level. What's going on? She held out a manila envelope, the way you'd hand someone a parking ticket. Efficient. Final. We need to do this now, Thomas. I put it off long enough. I open it standing right there, forklift idling somewhere behind me. The smell of coolant thick in the air. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My full legal name at the top. A court date already stamped 3 weeks out. You've had this a while. I said, not a question. I needed to be sure you'd actually see it. You have a way of not seeing things you don't want to see. I glanced at Gordon. He didn't look away. If anything, he straightened up slightly, like a man settling into a chair he'd already decided belonged to him. Is this why? I said, and stopped myself and started again. You're doing this here on purpose. I wanted witnesses, she said. I wanted this to actually happen instead of turning into another conversation you find a way to postpone. That landed the way she meant it to. I'll give her that much honesty. 19 years of me saying let's talk about it this weekend, and the weekend never quite arriving had built up a debt, and she decided to collect it all at once, in front of my crew, with a stranger standing close enough to put his hand on her back if he wanted to. He didn't. Not yet, but I saw him think about it. You should know, Melissa said, and here her voice picked up an edge of something rehearsed, something she'd practiced in a mirror or in Gordon's car on the drive over, that you're not entitled to what you think you are. Gordon's looked into it. That house isn't some untouchable thing, just because your name's on a deed somewhere. Community property is community property, Thomas. Is that right? You'll walk away with a fraction of what you think. I'd start getting used to that now if I were you. She let that sit a second, watching my face for something. Some crack. You've spent 19 years telling me to be patient. Well, I'm done being patient. And so is the settlement calculator, as it turns out. Gordon offered the smallest smile, the kind a man gives when he believes the outcome is already decided, and he's simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to reality. I looked at the papers again, then at her, then at him. Then I picked up a pen from Devin's workbench, flipped to the last page, and signed it right there on the shop floor, using a stack of shipping manifests as a hard surface. Melissa blinked. That wasn't the reaction she'd built the afternoon around. Have your attorney file it whenever's convenient, I said, handing it back. That's it. Something flickered across her face. Not relief, not quite. Something closer to suspicion, like she'd been braced for a fight that hadn't shown up and now didn't know what to do with her hands. That's it, I said. I finished my shift, started the line back up, walked it through the rest of the afternoon's run like nothing unusual had happened, because nothing that mattered to the work had happened. At 3:30, Marcus found a reason to stand next to me at the tool crib and say, without quite looking at me, "You all right, boss?" "I'm all right, Marcus." He nodded slowly, the way men do when they don't believe you but respect you too much to push. I drove home at the end of the shift, the garage door stuck on the first click. Same as always, caught on the second. I sat in the driveway a minute before I went in, listening to it settle, thinking about absolutely nothing, which is its own kind of shock. Some part of your mind just declines to process the day until you're somewhere safe enough to let it in. The house was already quieter than it should have been. Half her closet was empty. The bathroom counter on her side had been cleared down to bare tile, except for a bottle of lotion she always complained didn't pump right, and a single hair tie, forgotten, curled up near the faucet, like it hadn't gotten the memo that it wasn't wanted anymore either. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table. There was a stack of mail I'd been ignoring for the better part of 3 weeks, the way you ignore anything that isn't on fire yet. Asterisk, this is the part where most men either drink or call somebody. I did neither. I went through the mail instead. Asterisk. Bills. A reminder card from the dentist. A flyer for a landscaping service that had apparently decided my lawn needed help. And near the bottom, an envelope heavier than the rest. Creamstock, my full name, Thomas Andrew Reyes, printed across the front in a serif font that looked expensive just sitting there in a pile of junk mail. The return address was a law office downtown. Whitfield and Cross, a name I half recognized from a building near the courthouse. I almost set it aside for the recycling pile. I'd been putting off enough that week already. But something about the weight of the paper made me open it right there at the kitchen table, coffee going cold beside it, 3 paragraphs, formal language, a request that I contact the office regarding the estate of Walter Andrew Reyes, my grandfather, dead 11 years. I hadn't thought about him in longer than that. If I'm being honest, he'd been a quiet, private man who built our porch with his own 2 hands and said maybe 40 words to me total across my entire childhood, most of them instructions about tools. He died when I was in my early 40s, and the funeral had been small, and nobody had mentioned an estate, because as far as anyone in the family understood, there wasn't one worth mentioning. He'd lived simply, drove the same truck for 2 decades, left the house of my father, who'd since passed too, and the house had come to me the way things come to you in families that don't talk much. Quietly, without ceremony, assumed rather than announced. I called the number on the letterhead the next morning at 8:15 sharp. A woman named Denise answered and put me through to an attorney named Arthur Whitfield almost immediately. "Mr. Reyes," he said, "thank you for calling back so quickly. Is there a time today you could come in?" Something in the careful way he said it. Not urgent, exactly, deliberate. "I can be there by 10, I said. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to learn something about my grandfather that would rearrange everything I thought I understood about the house I'd lived in my entire adult life. If you made it this far and you're the kind of person who likes stories that take their time getting where they're going, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button now. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise the patience pays off. Whitfield and Cross occupied the 9th floor of an older building 2 blocks from the courthouse, the kind of place with brass fixtures and carpet thick enough to swallow footsteps. I showed up in my work jacket because I hadn't gone home to change, and I could smell the shop on myself the second I stepped into the lobby. Coolant and metal, out of place against all that quiet money. Arthur Whitfield stood when I came into his office. Actually stood the full way, not the polite half-rise people give you when they're not sure yet how much of their time you're worth. "Mr. Reyes, please sit." He was somewhere in his 60s, gray at the temples, the kind of calm that comes from decades spent delivering complicated news to people who weren't prepared for it. He had a folder already waiting on the desk, closed, squared up perfectly with the edge of the blotter. "Your grandfather passed in 2015, he said. "I understand you were aware of that. I was at the funeral. What you may not have been aware of," he said, "is that in 1987, your grandfather placed property at 14 Larchmont Drive into an irrevocable family trust, the Reyes Family Preservation Trust. I sat with that a second. The house, and the land it sits on." He opened the folder, turned it to face me, tapped a page near the top. The trust was structured specifically to keep the property outside the reach of probate, outside the reach of any individual family member's creditors, and this is a relevant part for you, Mr. Reyes, outside the reach of any spouse who might at some point come to believe they held an equal claim to it through marriage. I looked at the page. Legal language, dense, the kind of document you read 3 times and still feel like you're missing something underneath the words. "My grandfather did this in 1987, I said. "I was 15. "He did. And he updated the trust twice more before his death, once in 1998, once in 2009. Each time reaffirming that upon his passing, and upon your father's passing, the property would transfer entirely into your name specifically, not into any marital estate, not into any joint ownership structure, into a trust for which you are now the sole beneficiary and controlling trustee. Why wouldn't anyone have told me this?" Whitfield folded his hands. "Your grandfather was, from what I understood working with him, a man who believed some things were better protected in silence than announced. He told me once, and I wrote it down because it struck me that a man who doesn't know what he owns can't be talked out of it." I sat there a long moment, thinking about a man who built a porch with his own hands and said 40 words to me across an entire childhood, and how apparently every single one of those 40 words had been leading somewhere I couldn't have guessed. "So the house," I said slowly, working it through, "was never actually part of the marriage." "Not legally." "Correct. You and your wife have lived in the property. You've maintained it, paid the taxes and insurance from joint accounts, which is common and doesn't affect the trust standing. But ownership was never transferred to the marital estate, and Ohio law," he caught himself, Pennsylvania law, in your case, since we're filed here, does not treat property held in an irrevocable trust predating the marriage and never retitled as a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. Your wife has no claim to the property itself. She may have claims other marital assets accumulated during the marriage, but the house is not one of them. I thought about Melissa standing on the shop floor 2 days earlier in her new coat, telling me with total confidence that the house wasn't some untouchable thing just because my name was on a deed somewhere. Gordon's looked into it, she'd said. Gordon had looked into the wrong deed. What happens now? I said. Now, Whitfield said, you have a decision to make about how and when to make this known. I'd advise patience. In my experience, Mr. Reyes, people who believe they've already won tend to overextend themselves before the facts catch up. It's rarely wise to correct them too quickly. Asterisk, I didn't say anything for a while. I was still catching up to my own grandfather, a man I thought I'd understood and hadn't, not even a little. Asterisk. I drove home that afternoon without any particular hurry. The garage door stuck on the first click, caught on the second, same as it always did, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I sat in the driveway afterward and actually looked at the house. Really looked at it. The brick my grandfather had chosen. The porch he'd built board by board on weekends across 2 summers, according to my father, who used to hand him nails as a boy and never once complained about it, because that was apparently what you did for that man. I hadn't known any of this was resting on something that's solid. I just assumed it was mine, because it had always felt like mine, the same unexamined way you assume the ground under a house is stable until somebody shows you the foundation. Melissa's attorney called 11 days later, a man named Roy Castellan, brisk, confident, the kind of voice that's used to getting what it asks for, because most people fold before it becomes a fight. Mr. Reyes, I'm reaching out regarding the marital residence. My client is requesting an immediate appraisal with an eye toward either a buyout or sale, and even split of proceeds. Given the current market, we're looking at a property likely valued in the range of $1.1 to $1.3 million. You're welcome to request an appraisal, I said. I'd suggest you also request a title search. There was a pause on the line, brief, the kind that tells you a man has just heard something he wasn't expecting and hasn't decided yet whether to take it seriously. I'll be in touch, Mr. Reyes. Asterisk he would be, just not in the way he expected to be. Asterisk. I didn't call Whitfield that day to push things forward. I let it sit. I went to work. I ran my lines, checked tolerances, signed off on a quality audit that had been looming over that week before everything else happened, and I came home every evening to a quiet house and a garage door that stuck on the first click. Same as always, and I let Roy Castellan's confidence build exactly as much runway as it needed to eventually run out from under him. Melissa called on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the shop floor. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Thomas. Her voice had a careful quality to it, like she'd rehearsed the opening line and wasn't sure yet how the rest of the call was going to go. I heard from Roy that you said something about the title. I did. What does that mean? It means you should probably ask your attorney to do his homework before he sends me another letter about buyouts. A long pause. Gordon says you're bluffing. He says men do this. Try to scare people off before mediation. Gordon's a real estate agent, Melissa, not a title attorney. You're being cryptic on purpose. It's not attractive, you know. It never was. There was an old, familiar bite in that, the kind of thing she used to say when she wanted to needle something loose in me and see what fell out. I'm not trying to be attracted to you anymore. I said, evenly, no heat in it at all. I'm telling you the truth. And you can take it to your attorney, or you can wait and find out the hard way. Either one works for me. She hung up without saying anything else. Asterisk, I want to be honest with you about something. I wasn't doing this to punish her. Not yet. Anyway, I was doing it because a man had spent 30-plus years quietly making sure I'd be protected from exactly this moment. And I felt like the least I could do was let his work finish what it started before I said another word about it. Asterisk. The appraisal happened anyway, on Melissa's side. 10 days later, a woman came by with a clipboard while I was at work, and Melissa let her in, walked her through room by room, told her, according to my neighbor Ellen, who happened to see it from her porch, we're looking at this as a full asset top to bottom. The appraiser came back with a number just over $1.2 million. Melissa apparently took that number and ran with it, told friends, told her sister, told Gordon, who by every account started talking about when the sale closes like it was a foregone conclusion, like a man measuring a room for furniture that hadn't been paid for yet. Roy Castellan sent a formal letter 3 weeks after the appraisal, demanding my response to propose a vision of assets that included, front and center, a 50% claim against the appraised value of the Larchmont property. It was a confident letter. It used words like entitled and clear precedent. I read that letter twice at my kitchen table, and then I called Arthur Whitfield's office and told him it was time. Time for what specifically, he asked. Time to let them see the trust. There was a brief pause, and I could hear something like quiet approval in it. I'll prepare a formal response. I'd recommend we route it through mediation first, rather than straight to a contested hearing. Give her attorney the chance to withdraw the claim gracefully before it becomes a matter of public record in front of a judge. Fine by me, I said. But Arthur, I want the safety net for the employees who work under me handled too. Different matter, I know, but there are some things I've been meaning to fix at the shop, and I'd like your advice on the right way to do it without it looking like I'm buying goodwill. That's not typically what people call me for, Whitfield said, and I could hear something almost like a smile in it. But I appreciate the instinct. We'll get to that. First, let's handle the matter in front of us. I didn't know it yet, but the matter in front of us was about to get considerably more interesting because Roy Castellan had one more move left, and it was going to blow up in a mediation room 3 weeks later in a way none of us fully expected. That's where I'm going to pause the story for now. Part 2 picks up right where mediation begins. The moment Melissa's attorney finally opens the trust documents himself, the courtroom hearing that followed, and what happened to Melissa and Gordon in the months after the ruling came down. If you want to know how it ends, let me know you're ready and I'll pick it back up. Welcome back to those of you who asked for the rest of it. If you're just joining us, go find part 1 first. This won't make sense without the trust, the shop floor, or the garage door that's been sticking on the first click since the beginning of this story. For everyone else, let's pick it back up right where we left off. Mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a conference suite 3 floors below Arthur Whitfield's office, the kind of neutral room law firms keep for exactly this purpose. Beige walls, a long table, a box of tissues nobody ever wants to be the one to reach for first. I got there 10 minutes early. Whitfield was already seated, folders squared up in front of him the same careful way it had been the first day I met him. And this time there was a second folder beside it, thicker, tab along the side in a way that told me he did not intend to leave anything to interpretation. Melissa arrived with Roy Castellan at exactly 9. She was wearing the cream coat again. I noticed that. Small thing. Didn't mean anything. Probably. Except that some part of her still wanted to look like a woman who had the upper hand. She didn't look at me when she sat down. Roy did, though, and he gave me the kind of nod men give each other when they think they're about to win something and want you to know it ahead of time out of professional courtesy. The mediator, a retired judge named Constance Behar, opened the session the way these things always open, outlining process, reminding everyone that mediation was voluntary and non-binding, that anything said in the room stayed in the room unless it became part of formal filing. Standard language. Nobody in the room was really listening to it. Everybody in the room was watching everybody else. We'll start with the marital residence, Roy said, once introductions were done, since that appears to be the item requiring the most attention. He slid a folder across the table. The appraisal, the $1.2 million number circled at the top like it settled something on its own. My client is seeking an equal division of the equity in the property at 14 Larchmont Drive, consistent with Pennsylvania's equitable distribution standards for marital assets acquired or maintained during the course of the marriage. Here it comes. Before we go further, Whitfield said, unhurried, I'd like to enter something into the record for consideration. He opened the second folder, slid it across, the same unhurried way Roy had slid his. The property at 14 Larchmont Drive was placed into an irrevocable trust in 1987, prior to Mr. and Mrs. Reyes' marriage by more than a decade. It has remained in that trust continuously since. Mr. Reyes is the sole beneficiary and controlling trustee, a status confirmed and reaffirmed in trust amendments executed in 1998 and again in 2009. The property was never retitled into any marital or joint ownership structure at any point during the marriage. Roy reached for the folder. Read the first page. Then the second. I watched his face the way you watch weather change. Slow at first, and then all at once. He started and stopped and started again. When were you planning to disclose this? We're disclosing it now, Whitfield said, in good faith, before either party incurs further legal expense pursuing a claim against an asset that was never part of the marital estate to begin with. Melissa's expression hadn't caught up yet. She was still looking between Roy and the folder like she expected someone to explain the joke to her. What is he talking about? She said, quiet, to Roy, not to me. Give me a minute, Roy said, and I could hear something fraying at the edge of his voice already. The specific strain of a man recalculating an entire strategy in real time in front of a client who was still 3 steps behind him. Asterisk, I want to be honest with you. I felt something in that moment. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and steadier than that. The specific stillness of watching a thing you've been carrying alone for weeks finally set itself down on a table where other people could see it too. Asterisk. Judge Behar reviewed the trust documents herself for several minutes, unhurried. The room silent except for the sound of pages turning. This appears to be a properly executed and continuously maintained trust instrument, she said eventually. If accurate, and I have no immediate reason to doubt the documentation, the property would not be subject to equitable distribution as a marital asset. Counsel, I recommend you verify this independently before we proceed further on this item. I need a recess, Roy said. They took 40 minutes. I sat in the hallway with Whitfield, who didn't say much, because there wasn't much left to say, and Melissa sat at the far end of the same hallway with Gordon, who had shown up uninvited and been asked to wait outside the actual session, which told me something about how confident he'd been walking in that morning and how little of that confidence had survived contact with the folder. When they came back, Roy's tone had changed entirely. Softer, more careful. The tone of a man trying to salvage something out of a position that had just collapsed underneath him. We'd like to revisit the proposed terms, he said. Given the new information, we're prepared to withdraw the claim against the property specifically and focus on an equitable division of the remaining marital assets, retirement accounts, the joint savings, the vehicles. That's reasonable, Whitfield said. My client is prepared to be fair on those items. He always has been. Asterisk, I want you to notice something here, because it's the part people miss when they imagine revenge stories. There was no shouting, no dramatic unmasking, just a folder, a pause, and a room slowly rearranging itself around a fact that had been true the entire time and simply hadn't been looked at yet. Asterisk. Melissa finally looked at me directly for the first time that morning. You knew, she said, not accusing, exactly. Something closer to disbelief. This whole time, you knew and you let Roy send letters. You let the appraiser walk through the house. I knew, I said. I didn't lie to you about it. Melissa, I told your attorney to check the title before he sent that first letter. He didn't. You could have just told me. I did tell you. On the phone, you told me I was being cryptic. Gordon told you I was bluffing. I kept my voice even because there wasn't anything left to prove by raising it. I gave you the chance to look into it before it cost anyone more money. Nobody took me up on it. She didn't have an answer for that. Roy didn't either. The mediation ended an hour later with a tentative framework that removed the house from the table entirely and left the remaining assets, modest by comparison, the retirement accounts, the cars, a joint savings account that had never held more than $30,000 at its best, to be split according to standard formula. Asterisk, I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't, not quite, because Roy Castellan, 3 weeks later, tried one more thing, and it's the reason this whole matter ended up in front of an actual judge instead of quietly closing out in that mediation room. Asterisk. If you've stuck with this story through 2 long sittings, that tells me something about the kind of person you are, patient, the way this whole story has been about patience. Do me a favor and subscribe if you haven't. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to accounts like this one. The filing came in on a Thursday. Roy had apparently gone looking for an angle after the mediation fell apart, and the angle he found was this, an argument that because Melissa and I had, over 19 years of marriage, jointly paid the property taxes, homeowners insurance, and a significant portion of a roof replacement out of shared marital funds. She had established what his filing called an equitable interest by contribution, separate from and in addition to the trust's legal ownership. It was a real argument, in the sense that lawyers get paid to make arguments like it. It was also, according to Whitfield, a long shot dressed up to look like a sure thing, the kind of filing meant to pressure a settlement more than actually win in front of a judge. He's hoping you'll pay to make this go away rather than deal with a hearing, Whitfield told me over the phone. It's not an unreasonable strategy on his part. Most people would rather write a check than sit through a contested hearing. I'm not most people. I said, let's have a hearing. Asterisk, he didn't argue with me. I think, by that point, he'd figured out that arguing with me about patience was like arguing with a man about his own hands. Asterisk, the hearing was scheduled 6 weeks out, in front of a family court judge named Harriet Solomon, in a courtroom 2 floors up from where I'd once stood at 18 for a speeding ticket, and thought that was the worst legal trouble I'd ever be in. Different building energy this time. Quieter, more permanent. I wore the gray suit I bought years earlier for a cousin's wedding and worn twice since. I picked it up from the dry cleaner the day before and hung it on the back of the bedroom door, and looked at it for a while before I turned off the light. The way you look at something the night before it matters. Melissa was already seated with Roy when I came in. Gordon wasn't allowed in the courtroom itself. Family court hearings aren't spectator events the way divorce-adjacent drama sometimes gets imagined to be, but I heard later he'd waited in the parking garage the entire time, checking his phone every few minutes like a man expecting good news that never showed up. Judge Solomon reviewed the filings ahead of time, the way judges do, and opened the hearing with the flat efficiency of someone who has seen every version of this argument before and doesn't need theatrics to get to the truth of it. Counsel, she said to Roy, walk me through the equitable interest by contribution claim. Roy did his best. He talked about 19 years of jointly filed taxes on homeowners insurance, about the roof, about the fact that Melissa had painted rooms and hosted holidays and treated the house, in every functional sense, as her own home for nearly 2 decades. I don't dispute any of that, Whitfield said when it was his turn. My client doesn't dispute that his wife lived in and cared for that home for 19 years. What we're here to establish is a narrower legal question, whether ordinary contributions to the maintenance of a residence a couple resides in, absent any transfer title or any documented intention by the trust grantor or trustee to convert the asset into marital property, are sufficient to override an irrevocable trust executed decades before the marriage began. He produced the trust documents, the 1987 original, the 1998 amendment, the 2009 amendment, which specifically named me, not the trustee spouse, not the household, but me by name as sole beneficiary. He produced a recorded deed history showing the property had never been retitled at any point. He produced records of who had actually paid the trust's own separate maintenance reserve, a small account my grandfather had funded decades earlier specifically to cover major repairs like the roof, which meant even the roof. The centerpiece of Roy's whole argument had been paid for out of trust funds, not marital ones, something Melissa herself had apparently never known, and Roy clearly hadn't checked before filing. I watched Melissa's face when that came out. It's the kind of thing that's hard to describe unless you've seen it. The particular expression of someone realizing, in real time, in a room full of strangers, that a story they've been telling themselves for months has just quietly stopped being true. Judge Solomon took a recess to review the documents herself. When she came back, she didn't take long. The trust is validly executed, properly maintained, and unambiguous in its terms, she said. The property at 14 Larchmont Drive is not a marital asset. Contributions toward its ongoing maintenance during the marriage, absent any documented intent by the trustee to convert its status, do not establish an equitable interest sufficient to override the trust's clear language. The petitioner's claim regarding the property is denied in full. Asterisk, no dramatic gavel moment. No raised voices. Just a woman in a black robe reading a decision off a page in the same tone she'd probably used 20 times that week for 20 other cases. And somewhere underneath that flat, procedural calm, an entire chapter of my life quietly closing. Asterisk. Roy didn't look at me on the way out. Melissa did, for just a second, in the hallway outside the courtroom, and there wasn't anger in it anymore. There was something closer to exhaustion, like she'd been carrying a version of the future for months. The house sold, the money split, a fresh start with Gordon funded by half of something that had never actually been half hers, and now she had to set that version down and figure out what was actually left standing. The remaining assets were divided a few weeks later along standard lines. Nothing dramatic. Nothing either of us contested. I kept the truck. She kept the car she'd always driven. The retirement account split according to formula. It was, in the end, an unremarkable financial settlement wrapped around one very remarkable piece of paper my grandfather had filed away decades before either Melissa or I had any idea it would matter this much. I heard, through people who still talked to people who knew her, what happened after. Gordon's enthusiasm cooled fast once the house was off the table. Men like that build their attention around outcomes, and once the outcome he'd been circling disappeared, so did most of his patience for what remained. Melissa moved into an apartment across town, a 2-bedroom she couldn't quite afford comfortably on her salary alone, especially once it became clear that whatever future she and Gordon had been narrating to each other for the better part of a year wasn't going to include the equity cushion either of them had been counting on. I ran into her exactly once after everything settled, at a grocery store on the north side, months later. She looked tired in a way that wasn't about age. We stood in the cereal aisle for a moment, both of us deciding whether to pretend we hadn't seen each other. "You look well," she said finally. "I'm all right." "The house?" she started, and then seemed to decide against finishing the sentence. "Whatever it was going to be, it's still standing," I said. "Same porch. Same garage door that never opens on the first try." Something flickered across her face at that. Something almost like a small, sad laugh that didn't quite make it all the way out. "You never did fix that thing." "I fixed it, actually, a couple months back." She nodded slowly, like that meant something to her, that she wasn't going to say out loud. And we said the kind of goodbye people say when there's nothing left to argue about and nothing left to salvage either, and that was that. She called once more about 4 months after the divorce finalized, on a Sunday evening. I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up anyway. "I made a mistake," she said, quiet, none of the rehearsed edge from those early calls left in it. I think I knew it before the hearing. Honestly, I just didn't want to be the one to say it first. I let the silence sit there a moment. Some things deserve room before you answer them. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I'm not looking to go back to what we had. Melissa, I don't think you're either. Not really. I think you're looking to go back to before any of this happened. And that's a different thing, and it isn't on the table." She didn't argue. I think some part of her had already known that's what I'd say, and had called anyway, because some conversations need to happen even when you already know how they end. Here's what I'd tell anyone standing where I stood on that shop floor, watching a woman in a coat you don't recognize hand you papers in front of people you work with every day, a stranger standing close enough to touch her shoulder. The thing that could have destroyed me wasn't the papers. It wasn't Gordon's practiced little smile in the doorway of a machine shop that had nothing to do with him. It wasn't even 19 years of marriage quietly running out of road while I wasn't paying close enough attention to notice. It was a story I could have told myself in that moment. That being handed those papers in front of my crew meant I'd already lost. That quiet meant weak. That a man who signs without arguing is a man who has nothing left to argue with. That story would have been wrong. My grandfather knew something I didn't know about myself back then, which is that the things worth protecting are rarely the things you're shouting about in the moment. He spent 30 years quietly making sure that whatever happened to me, wherever my life eventually landed, I'd have solid ground under me that nobody could talk me out of, not even someone standing right there in a room telling me with total confidence that I own nothing. I didn't win anything in that mediation room or that courtroom. I just found out, a little later than I should have, exactly what already belonged to me the whole time. The garage door still catches on the first click. I fixed the motor, finally, the way I'd been meaning to for years, but I never bothered adjusting the sensor that makes it stutter once before it commits. Some habits are worth keeping around, even after you've fixed everything they used to remind you is broken. If you've been with this one since the shop floor, thank you for staying with it. If you want more accounts like this one, you know what to do.